to the people, we are setting up an independent mechanism to do it. It is going to be a team of people headed by Professor Ghani of the University of the West Indies coming around and discussing this constitution with you. So that for you to be able to make a meaningful contribution, the PNM considers that we have to explain to you what this thing is all about, and that you must understand it. And I was very pleased that so many of you have followed us in our public meetings, so many of you have followed us on the radio, so many of you have followed us on the national television and on the internet, all of you with one objective in mind. Let us educate ourselves so that we can make a meaningful contribution at the right time. I am very proud, my dear friends, of all of you. And you will remember that we said, if you want to discuss a constitution, if you want to understand a constitution, there are certain concepts that you have to understand. The most important being the concept of the separation of powers. Remember that? Remember we said that in the year 1748, a Frenchman by the name of Montesquieu enunciated that philosophy of a separation of powers as between the executive, which is the government, the judiciary, which is the judiciary as you know it, and the legislature, which is the parliament. Clear separation of powers as between them, with a clear role and responsibility for each one. And those must be separate from each other because, as Montesquieu put it, if those powers are not separate, and if there is too much overlap of powers and the encroachment on one on the other, it is a recipe for chaos and anarchy and confusion. So therefore it has to be separate. All right, how are we going? Good. You will also remember that we committed ourselves, and we have been committed all the time as PNM, to a strong and independent judiciary. The judiciary has to be independent, my dear friends, so that it can properly be the check and balance on the executive that it is designed to be. That supreme to our operations is our constitution, which are the rules by which our society is to be governed, and all the laws that are made in our country are made in accordance with that constitution. And the judiciary is there to decide when you infringe those laws, when you do not infringe those laws. And that they must be free from the interference of anybody, particularly the executive, in the discharge of that function, so that they can guarantee, as a consequence, the democracy and the freedoms of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Remember we also said that the discharge of certain administrative functions as it relates to the judiciary does not encroach on judicial independence. And in fact, we went on to say that we believe that the executive has the responsibility to provide to the judiciary all that it requires to be able to independently carry out its independent function. Remember we said that? Right. But we said that the best way of doing that, in our view, is to establish a Ministry of Justice. But that in doing that, because of the possibility of the encroachment on the executive, on judicial independence, we have to set a policy that is designed by the executive and the judiciary working together. And when that policy is arrived at, we give constitutional and legal guarantees to ensure that the over-enthusiasm of any executive does not encroach on the independence of the judiciary. Okay? How are we going? So, my dear friends, a strong and independent judiciary arising out of all we have said is a consequence of the prescriptions that we have now put forward. And we are very pleased. Strong and independent judiciary. But you also need a strong and independent legislature. And to be able to achieve that, remember what we said, as it now stands, of the 26 members of the PNM, 22 are members of the executive, 26 in the parliament. So that to a very large extent, the theorists will argue that the executive has too much influence on the legislature under the current system of government of Trinidad and Tobago. And that one sure way of being able to change that properly is by doing what so many other countries in the Western Hemisphere have done, to go to a presidential system of government, where is a presidential system of government, my dear friends, where the members of the executive don't, by and large, come from within the legislature at all. The ministers of government come from outside of the parliament, even if in the model that we are suggesting, there is a small number of ministers that will come from the lower and the upper house. And when you do that, you are going to create a large number of backbenchers in the parliament, putting the parliament in a position for the first time in the history of Trinidad and Tobago to set up a system of parliamentary committees. And these parliamentary committees can now act as a check and balance on the work of the executive. Correct? Superior model. So that the parliament now becomes strong. You now have a strong parliament able to discharge its functions. If you now have a strong parliament and you now have a strong judiciary, both of them acting as checks and balances on the executive, all that you now need, my dear friends, in the face of the legal and constitutional guarantees, all that you now need is a strong executive with determined leadership, determined to deliver to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that which we said we will deliver when we came to you and asked you for your support in a general election. Too many people in this country feel that the judiciary must be strong, the legislature must be strong, but you must tie the government's hands behind its back. It just cannot work that way. You put in your guarantees, put in your checks and balances, put them in, and the new draft working document suggests that. Not that we agree with everything in it. And I have pointed out a number of areas with which I myself do not agree, but of course these things have to be discussed in the party. But what we are saying is a strong and independent judiciary, a strong and independent legislature, my dear friends. You need now a strong executive with the ability and the determination and the will to carry out its program for the benefit of the majority of the people of Trinidad and Tobago in the shortest possible time. There is one more concept, and it impinges on the separation of powers. There is one more concept that I would like to discuss with you this afternoon. It is the concept of parliamentary privilege. The concept of parliamentary privilege. You see, my dear friends, because the learning says that if you want the legislature to be able to carry out its functions, and they are twofold, one is to pass laws, and the second one is to scrutinize the work of the executive by way of debate and by way of inquiry, which is the committee system. If you want to be able to do that properly, then people must be free to say what they wish. Because if you place an obligation on someone to check the facts of everything he has to say before he says it in Parliament, what in effect you do is you curtail his freedom of speech, and you curtail the ability of Parliament to properly carry out its function. So the concept, my dear friends, of parliamentary privilege came into being in 1689. Remember when they passed the Bill of Rights in the British Parliament? They included in the Bill of Rights the concept of, as it now stands, parliamentary privilege boils down to 1, freedom of speech, 2, freedom from arrest in civil matters, and I'll explain why that became necessary, and 3, exemption from jury service for all members of Parliament and their spouses. That is what it boils down to now. There was a time, and it started with, remember we talked about a line of kings that came to power in England in the 1600s, the 17th century. These were the Scottish kings, the Stuarts, and that King James of Scotland became James I of England. And what distinguished these Stuarts was this concept they had that we describe as the divine right of kings. That is to say, that they were governing by way of a special dispensation from Almighty God. and therefore they were monarchs of all they surveyed. That's how they saw it. So that